This is the Death of Socrates, painted by Jacques-Louis David in 1787. It is a defining masterpiece of the French Neoclassical movement, a movement that David himself helped invent and bring into reality. Before saying anything more, it's important to understand just how striking this painting is, even if you know nothing about it. So much is immediately visible: the clarity of the scene, the powerful initiative of the man at the center, the dramatic interaction between the cup and the reaching hand, the way light angles toward that moment, the figures, the soft folds of fabric, and the bare, flat stone walls. As the title suggests, the painting depicts the death of Socrates, as described by Plato in his famous work Phaedo, often translated as Dialogue on the Soul. Socrates was condemned by an Athenian court for failing to acknowledge the gods of the city and for corrupting the minds of the youth. His sentence was death by drinking hemlock, as Plato also recounts in another dialogue, Crito. Socrates could have escaped into exile. Instead, he chose death, using the moment as an opportunity to deliver his final lesson: that death is not frightening to the philosopher, but a path toward the liberation and divinization of the soul. David chooses to paint the decisive moment, the instant Socrates extends his hand to take the poison. He has been speaking at length about the immortality of the soul and appears entirely unconcerned with the fact that he is about to carry out his own execution. On the contrary, Socrates seems to move eagerly toward the afterlife. David depicts him as physically idealized. Historically, Socrates would have been around 70 years old at the time, and certainly not the muscular, handsome figure shown here. A strong light enters from the upper left, illuminating Socrates as the brightest figure in the composition. Muted colors dominate the edges, but the center comes alive: the executioner dressed in red, Socrates in white. For David, Socrates represents moral strength, triumphing over desire, absolute commitment to clear principles, even in the face of death. This was the ethical message David intended for the French people, painted just 2 years before the French Revolution, at a time when the monarchy was weakening and reformers sought to prove the legitimacy of democracy, just as it had once been tested in ancient Athens, or in the United States, which had completed its own revolution only 5 years earlier. In fact, Thomas Jefferson himself was present when this painting was unveiled at the Salon in 1787. An image that captured this attention of radical political reformers quickly became famous. David had already established his reputation with another morally severe painting, The Oath of the Horatii, which effectively defined Neoclassicism. The movement drew from the harsh simplicity of ancient Greece and Rome, from an obsession with anatomy and muscular form, from frozen historical moments rendered in rigid, two-dimensional space. Neoclassicism, as David presented it, was forceful and uncompromising. It stood in direct opposition to the dominant Rococo style, which celebrated ornamentation, luxury, and aristocratic excess. In The Oath of the Horatii, as in the Death of Socrates, those who sacrifice themselves for a principle are depicted in strong geometric postures. Those ruled by emotion appear bent, collapsed, and weak. The background remains flat to focus attention on the foreground, where actions can be read clearly from side to side. One way to read the Death of Socrates is from right to left: the suffering disciples twisting in grief, leading toward Socrates' calm expression, and finally arriving at his right hand hovering above the poisoned cup. That space between the hand and the cup sits exactly at the center of the painting. It represents the peak of emotional tension, embodied in the executioner, who averts his gaze, unable to face Socrates. Finally, there is the seated figure at the edge of the bed, silent and uninvolved for now. David does not label any figures, but from historical accounts we can identify them. The woman in the background is likely Xantippe, Socrates' wife, standing apart in grief. The man grasping Socrates' leg is Crito, one of his oldest and most devoted students. David signs his name beneath Crito, suggesting a personal identification. David sees himself as morally weaker than Socrates, yet still striving toward that ideal. The painter altered several historical details. He reduced the number of people present from more than 15 to 12, mirroring the number of disciples in Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. But the most important change is the addition of the figure seated at the edge of the bed. This is Plato, the man who made Socrates' teachings immortal by casting him as the central figure in over 30 philosophical dialogues. Without Plato, there would be no Socrates as we know him. Historically, Plato was not present at Socrates' death, and he was a young man at the time. David depicts him as elderly and withdrawn. Earlier, we read the painting from right to left, but it can also be read from left to right. The entire scene appears to erupt from Plato's mind, reconstructed as memory, as an idealized recollection. Socrates points upward, just as Plato does in Raphael's School of Athens. Plato is placed apart from the flat background, where the frozen moment stretches beyond time and reality. It's astonishing how memory often presents itself this way. Smoothed angles, perfect lighting, flattened space, carefully arranged to serve the needs of the present. Through Plato, the harsh ethical reality of the scene is betrayed by retrospective idealization. Years later, the revolutionary ideals of the French Revolution would also be betrayed by the terrifying reality that followed. Perhaps that is why David signs his name again here, almost prophetically. Neoclassicism may appear severe and explicit, but in the Death of Socrates, an extraordinary amount is happening. It is a convergence of history, philosophy, politics, and aesthetics, delivered with power, precision, and beauty. In other words, it is a masterpiece.